Hi Georg, nice to have you here today with us. Today we are going to talk about CBAM. Can you quickly introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your role at Osapiens?
Hi, yes, I'm Georg. I am the team lead of the Rollout team, which means that my team and I are taking care of the spreading of knowledge internally in our organization. So knowledge about the solution in different ways. This includes, of course, pre-sales. It includes the creation of customer and prospect facing slide decks for the solutions. It includes user manuals, and of course it includes the enablement of sales to deeply dive into the solutions and knowing the topics that are relevant.
Perfect. So let's talk about CBAM directly, right? Do you have some challenges companies face when preparing for CBAM?
Yeah, the biggest challenges that we hear and that we see when talking with CBAM affected companies are, on the one hand, identifying in their own organization which are their CBAM affected products, affected because they're importing them from non-EU countries, and on the other hand, of course, the data gathering of the emissions data that they need from their direct suppliers in the non-EU countries. And the challenge with that is that those non-EU suppliers often do not have this type of emissions data yet. Many of those suppliers are on their way to installing schedules and programs to actually collecting this type of data, but yeah, the majority, as we see it right now, is not there yet and cannot just provide this emissions data.
Okay, so CBAM actually requires companies to track emissions across their supply chains, right? What are their key data points those companies need to collect, and where do you see the biggest data gaps?
The key data points for CBAM affected companies, of course, on the one hand is understanding the effectiveness of their products. This is within their own organization. And to the data gathering, of course, it is as soon as they have understood how much they have imported of which product from which supplier, they need to gather data about the operator that created this product, also about the installation, which basically is the production plant where the product was produced, and then of course the direct and indirect embedded emissions that were created when producing this good. And those indirect and direct emissions are also the main challenges for those non-EU suppliers, because they have to be calculated and sometimes also taking into account their prerequisites, their precursors.
Okay, so let's assume that many businesses struggle with these calculating of the embedded emissions, right? What approaches or methods can you recommend for precise carbon accounting?
To do a CBAM compliant accounting of those emissions values for the EU based companies that are CBAM affected, it's very important to reach out to the suppliers as early as possible, to get into dialogue, to clearly state what is needed from the EU organization's point of view, in order to also in the future work together compliantly also under CBAM. And to do this, also software tools such as osapiens Hub for CBAM really help to simplify this data gathering process, to simplify what data is needed from the supplier, such that the supplier in the supplier portal can easily detect, okay, for this product that they sold to an EU company, now they have to calculate these direct and indirect emissions. And this also enables them to do it and to understand what actually they have to calculate and have to do, because also guidance is given how the calculation can be handled.
All right, so from a regulation perspective, the EU transitional phase for CBAM has already started, right? In your opinion, how well prepared are companies so far, and where do you see the biggest needs for improvement?
Well, from what we hear from the companies that we are talking to, and this is quite many, and also from the lawyers that are our legal advice, is that only really a small percentage of the affected companies in the EU has actually submitted their CBAM reports in time, or has submitted a report at all yet. So still within this transitional phase, we are now moving towards 2026 when things are having financial impact for companies. So this is where, from our point of view, the preparedness of companies in the EU market is not matching at all the phase that we are in and the next phase that is just about to start.
Okay, so talking about financial impact, the carbon pricing is another critical element of CBAM, right? How do you see this evolving in the future, and how can companies also strategically prepare for this potential cost impacts?
CBAM affected companies, or even some of them, have actually understood quite early in the CBAM process that once they have implemented CBAM within their actual processes, they can actually benefit from this knowledge that they gain, because taking into account the carbon pricing in the future, it really makes a big difference for them whether they are importing from a supplier that produces goods with low emissions or from a supplier that produces goods with high emissions, because it has a direct cost effect on them. So in the future, both the European entities that are importing CBAM goods can distinguish between more and less costly suppliers based on the carbon pricing. And on the other hand, companies all around the world that are non-EU entities and that are producing those CBAM relevant goods can differentiate by producing goods in a very green mode, saying with very little emissions, because then they really get a market advantage, because European importers can import their goods with lower carbon pricing.
So the osapiens Hub for CBAM helps businesses streamline compliance, right? Can you walk us through the key features of the platform that are simplifying the CBAM reporting process?
Yes, so osapiens Hub for CBAM is set up to help customers with the interaction with their suppliers, with the calculation of the results concerning the emissions that they used per quarter or per reporting period, and of course with the creation of a CBAM report automatically within the tool, taking into account the imports relevant for a certain period, and then of course the export of this ready-made report to just submit it to the transitional registry that is relevant for CBAM. So breaking it down to functionalities, the storing of master data for the products of our customers, the upload of the real imported volumes of products connected to the master data products, as well as the sending of data requests to the suppliers, who then can actually fill in those emissions values in their supplier portal and send back this data to our customers, that then can just create a CBAM report that they can hand in with the EU.
All right, and for the companies that are just starting with these processes, what are the first essential steps to prepare for CBAM?
For those companies, the recommendation is to make a very precise impact analysis. In many use cases, we see that companies are also taking into account their legal advice, because when it comes to those customs topics, it's always very important to have a good understanding of tariff codes, of HS codes in this sense. So the impact analysis is very important. And then, as in many other supply chain related compliance regulations, it's very important to reach out to the suppliers as early as possible in the process, to make sure also the suppliers have some time to understand the new situation and to enable themselves to actually provide the data that is needed from them.
All right, and finally, if you had to give one game-changing advice for businesses navigating CBAM, what would it be?
Well, we see that those companies are successful within their CBAM challenge that get the right departments involved, which could be tax or customs department as well as the purchasing or import department, then get started by implementing a CBAM process internally, and then of course reach out to the suppliers and make sure they have understood that in the future it really depends on them to calculate emissions, and also it depends on the result of the emissions calculation, because as said earlier, those companies that are producing goods with lower emissions will have a competitive advantage in the future when it comes to the selling of CBAM related products.
Thanks a lot, Georg, for your time.
Thank you very much.